Okay, well, welcome everybody to this James Bible study. We have been working through the book of James over the last number of weeks and months, verse by verse, right the way through from James chapter 1, verse 1, and we are now up to James chapter 5, verses 17 to 18. You can find all the previous episodes on our YouTube channel and on any podcast platform, but we're going to be picking up the study from those verses, chapter 5 verses 17 to 18. We're going to begin by reading through these verses. Elijah was a human being even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it did not rain on the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. And so here James, he continues on this theme of prayer that he's been talking about for the last few verses, and he hones in on the character of Elijah. So Dr. John, I wonder if you could just open up, what are some of the things that we know about this character of Elijah and why maybe James brings him up?
Yes, now Elijah, he lived at the time of Ahab, one of the kings of Israel, and Ahab was evil. In fact, more evil than all of his predecessors. And he worshipped the pagan god Baal. So there was this tension here. There was Elijah living for Yahweh, the true God, and there was Ahab and the priests of Baal who were kind of opposing him. Elijah was sent by God to challenge Ahab because of his evil ways. I think... thinking of John the Baptist in the New Testament, challenging Herod because of his adultery. And it's a kind of dangerous thing in those days or any days to challenge the king. So in some ways, that took some bravery. He declared to Ahab that he served Yahweh, the God of Israel, and that it would not rain for several years unless that's Elijah, said that it would rain. So this was, God has sent him, and God said, look, Elijah said to Ahab, there's a sign here that God is with me because God's going to answer my prayers, and it's going to stop raining, and it's not going to start raining until I say it's going to rain. Not because of his own power, because of the power of Yahweh, the eternal God. So that would have angered Ahab, I think, that kind of challenge. And it's interesting because in some ways Elijah showed kind of bravery there, but then the king gets angry. He went away and hid in a ravine, and God sent ravens to feed him. And so he's kind of challenging and then running away. Right. The Bible is so honest; it just paints the picture. And we're human beings, and I think that's the thing that James says. Elijah was a human being; he's just ordinary, and he has kind of weaknesses. With Elijah, the word of the Lord came to him on a number of occasions. We can read that in Kings. One occasion, he directed Elijah to go to a particular widow's house to receive food. The woman had hardly any flour and oil left and was facing starvation with her and her son. And again, God worked a miracle and provided so that food did not run out. Right. So, we've got the picture here of Elijah being a servant of God. Elijah following God's commands and challenging what was wrong and what was evil, but still a very human person who kind of ran away and at times got quite under the weather. He thought, everything's against me, no one is serving God, I'm the only one, type of thing. So it's a very human picture there.
He's an incredibly inspiring example to bring up for the Jewish people, isn't he? You almost think of, the iconic heroes of the Jewish faith. Elijah's got to be one of them. You think about, children today have their superheroes on the TV, whether it's, Spider-Man or whoever it may be. You almost think that people back then, be Elijah, who was one of their heroes. They want to grow up to be like him. And he's an incredibly compelling man of faith, isn't he, Pastor Fraser? I mean, anything almost just to add to almost that profile of Elijah's life, what he was like.
Yeah, well, to kind of sit these verses in the context of the passage that James has just said, that on the last episode we covered this, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective, and you could, have all these kind of like self-doubts and different things, and then, James comes along and says, Elijah, you can pray like Elijah, and it didn't rain, and then it did rain, and again he prayed, but he also gives you this wonderful like little line that says Elijah was a human being just as we are, because we have this, sometimes we can put people on a pedestal, can't we? Like you're saying, like superhero, it's great to look up to them, but like he was a human being just as us, and we see that, as Dr. John said, with some of the frailties, of we see these great miracle where he calls down fire from heaven, onto the bull, where there's a bit of the competition happening, isn't there? The prophets of Baal, they have a bull and they pray all day, and Elijah kind of mocking them, which I kind of really like. It's good little competitive chat, I guess. And he's, all day they're praying, and he's like, oh, is your God busy? Is he, I think one translation's like, is he on the toilet? Like, where's your God? He's not answering. And then, before he calls fire then down on his bull, on the as the offering, he then gets them to pour, like, I think it's 12 containers of water over it to show that, with our God, anything is possible. Then this happens, and he, slaughters the prophets of Baal. And then, Ahab's wife is like, oh, I'm going to kill him. And then all of a sudden he's done this great miraculous miracle. And then all of a sudden he's depressed and running for his life. Yeah. This should be his, his Hall of Fame moment, his post-match interview where he's relishing everything. But then he's depressed and he's running away, and he says, God, I just want to, end my life. Like I'm done. And praise God that God didn't answer that prayer. And what did God do? He gave him some food and let him sleep. And one of the key lessons there is sometimes you just need a nap and a snack, and you're going to be okay. But it's amazing, though, the difference. And it kind of shows the frailty of Elijah as well. Yeah. That actually the prayers have power not because of who we are, but because of who God is. Amazing. And, you're absolutely right. The context of the passages as well, it is all about that prayer. These verses flow just off of what James says, the prayer of a righteous person is powerful and effective. It's almost like he holds Elijah up as this wonderful example of a man of faith. Of course, the power comes from God. It's been said that prayer is where, ordinary people meet with the extraordinary power of God. And like the power comes from God, doesn't it? But, just like Elijah, we need to have that faith to pray and engage with that power. But he also had his weaknesses. He was still a human, just like we are, just like James's audience. So what encouragement do you think that James's readers, Dr. John, would have taken away from this?
I think the message here that these great heroes of faith are just ordinary people like you and me. They've been called and empowered by God to serve him. So we kind of look at Elijah and the miracles he was doing. I like the story where he calls down fire to consume these soldiers. Not that I like the soldiers being consumed, but it's just there. He's calling down fire from heaven. And that consumes these soldiers, presumably attacking him. But what I find interesting is that in the New Testament times, James and John, they've been sent out with Jesus. They're going to towns, preaching the gospel, and one town turns them away. And it's interesting because James and John say, "What do you want us to call down fire from heaven and destroy that village?" And Jesus rebuked them. So it's interesting how they're looking at stories that they're familiar with. But Jesus is bringing kind of the mercy aspect of that. So there's so much from, I think, Elijah's life as an example, of faith, an example of trusting. But he did kind of say, "Oh, I'm the only one. Everybody's there's no one else. I'm the one that's only one left." And God says to him, "No, you're not. There's thousands more who are not worshipping the false god Baal." Yeah. Elijah prayed earnestly, and the miracles happened. So the message I think that James is getting across here is not to give up in prayer. Great. And I think of the parable Jesus told about the persistent widow to the judge, and she comes again and again and again. To plead a cause, and Jesus said because, of her persistence, she got what she was asking for. And I think that's very important there, the persistence. And again, it links into this perseverance, not to give up and carry on. And the other thing, I think, the message from this is that Elijah had a wrong assessment of the situation. He thought it was really, 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 really bad, and yet it wasn't as bad as he thought. And whereas, I think these people at the time were going through persecutions and difficulties which were hard, but I think it help them maybe to get a sense of perspective. Though they're going through these trials and difficulties, they've got a God who is strong, who is powerful, who will provide their needs, who will never leave them or forsake them. And so to give them encouragement that despite how things are or how they may perceive things, that God is always there and God is going to work good through the situation.
That's brilliant. That's brilliant. And, that's one of the things about Elijah is that earnestness in prayer, isn't it? And I suppose, people, you could easily read these verses and think, right then, okay, I'm going to put this to the test and I'm going to pray for it to not rain and stuff. But I suppose that would almost be a misinterpretation of what James is getting at here a little bit. It's not that Elijah prayed those prayers as a magic trick, to demonstrate what he could do by praying. But, I suppose the context of these verses is that King Ahab at the time, he was, 1 Kings, you read through the opening 16 chapters of 1 Kings and it is just the mess ups of king after king after king after king. And it gets to Ahab and it says that Ahab was more evil than all of the rest that had come before him. And, I suppose that's the thing about Elijah calling it to not rain. It's a statement of judgment on those people and of where Ahab's leadership was at the time there. But then when he prays, Pastor Fraser, just for you to comment on this, when he prays for it to rain again, there's that really significant thing, isn't there, where he prays for it to rain, and he goes out and he doesn't see a cloud. And he goes back and he prays and he prays again, and and there's nothing, and he prays again, and then it talks about that cloud the size of a man's hand. What lessons, what encouragements could we take from that aspect of Elijah's life?
Lots. I love what you say. It's not a magic trick. It's not like, flip. We'd love that. I mean, we're, in England right now. We'd love to be able to pray for it to stop raining and for some sun. But it was because Elijah's heart was in tune with God's will. And that's what prayer's effective, isn't it?
Right.
Is that it was in tune with God's will. And when he started to pray for it to rain again, it was because it was in tune with God's will and God's heart. To pray earnestly, it means to pray with prayers. That's what that means, to pray with prayers. And so we should be diligent in praying. And actually the power of prayer is not in the one who prays it, but in the one who answers it. So that's another lesson I guess we can learn. From Elijah. And it's, kind of our heart being in tune with God, not my will being done, but God's will being done. And that's how we should really pray. And I guess as well, the other thing to take away from this is, it says in the previous verse, like the prayers of a righteous person is effective. But righteousness is not perfection. And we see that through Elijah, but it's still effective because it's not in us that the power comes from, but it's in God that the power comes from. So keep praying, keep believing. God's amazing.
Really, really helpful.
Another thing as well, I think a parallel that comes out is the people at Elijah's time were under the rule of an evil king. And of course, with the early church, the Roman emperors, some were better than others, but there were some, and Nero particularly, were very evil, huge amount of persecution. And of course, today in the world, there are evil rulers, and there are Christians in the country who are living under the kind of persecution from that. And I think the message here with Elijah, with the people at James's time and the people in the world today, that despite having these rulers who are evil, that God is almighty on the throne. And these, like with Ahab, like with the Roman emperors, their rule is only temporary. And God's rule is eternal, and the eternal God is with them all the time through, encouraging them to be persevering, to look into God for help and strength.
I love that because in 1 Kings 17:1, like Elijah, I was about to say Isaiah, Elijah stands before the king and he says, as surely as the Lord God of Israel lives, before who I stand. It tells us the source of his strength. Like he was before this king who was evil and who had killed loads of the prophets of God, yet he's fearless because he knows his power comes from the King of Heaven, which gives us great, I guess, strength and encouragement to persevere in, a society and a culture that is not following God. Like we can stand out, I guess, like you're saying, Dr. John, like even though whatever's going on, no, we can be fearless, we can follow God, and we can be faithful in challenging situations. Another lesson from the life of Elijah.
Well, yeah, I mean, you brought up the story of Elijah versus the prophets of Baal. I mean, I believe that the numbers were that it was, Elijah in one corner and then there was 850 other prophets, in the other corner. You think about, the Christians that were living at that time and, even, today it can be easy to think like, oh, actually, there's so many more actually in a different corner than to the corner that we're in. But actually, when you've got God in your corner, then actually, you're onto a winner there. And so, yeah, I suppose, one lesson I'd certainly take away from Elijah's example is don't write yourself off from God using your life to do amazing things, just like Elijah did. We've commented on some of his, strengths, great man of faith, fearless. When it came to the situation against the prophets of Baal, he had great faith to believe God for the impossible. But he also had those weaknesses which are relatable. Went to the extremes and had a misassessment of the situation, isolated himself when he was struggling, relied too heavily on the voices of others. I believe it was Delilah, Delilah's voice that caused him to go into hiding after him calling down fire on the altar against the prophets of Baal. But there's something relatable about that and inspiring that we too can have our lives used by God.
And interesting what Pastor Fraser was saying about where God sent the fire to burn up the sacrifice that Elijah had put there. And afterwards, the people there, they fell down and they cried, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." That's Yahweh. And so his life, his witness had an impact on those around, and they actually acknowledged that the God of Elijah was the Almighty God. And I think that brings encouragement for the people, for us, and also the people that James was writing to initially, that God is Almighty, and that what they are doing for him, as they're serving him, and they're witnessing for him, that has an impact on the people around. And there will be people, despite all the evil that's going on, there will be people that see what God is doing and will acknowledge that. And like the people there said, they acknowledge that the Lord, He is God.
Amazing. Pastor Fraser, just any further comments on Elijah's example and what we can take away from his life today?
Absolutely. I think about when he was downcast and just discouraged, and God gave him the food and the rest. And then what Elijah really needed in that moment was he'd seen great miracles, but he was still downcast and discouraged. You can see all the miracles, but you can still be downcast and discouraged. You can have great theology, as important as that is, but you can still be downcast and discouraged. What Elijah needed in that moment was a personal encounter with God. And that's what he got. He went to the mountain and, the earthquake, the fire, but God wasn't in those things. It was in the small, gentle whisper. And actually, when we're downcast and discouraged, the thing that we need the most is a personal encounter with our incredible God, and that changes absolutely everything. And then one more, I guess, as a bit of a bonus one, is that God will provide. God provided for Elijah in so many unique ways. It wasn't in the abundance of the rich people that we spoke about in previous episodes, but it was a daily provision. Where the ravens brought him meat. He was by the brook. There was a drought, but he was by a brook that didn't run out. When it ran out, he then went to the widow, who then, there was miraculous provision in the flour and the oil with cakes baked on coals. God will provide. We've just got to keep trusting in him, keep following him, keep going for it. And I don't understand it, but God will make a way. And
that would have been profoundly encouraging to the people James is writing to there, especially the poor who are being taken advantage of by the rich land rulers. Really encouraging. Dr. John, any final comments on Elijah's example?
I think to sum up, it gives us encouragement to carry on, to know we've got a great God who is with us, who will never leave us, and that in prayer there is power, because we are praying to a powerful God. It's not in our own strength. And despite what is going on around, I think it's important to get a kind of God's perspective. You can sometimes look at all the evil that's going around to think that God's lost control. The thing is, God doesn't condone or make the evil. The people have free will, but ultimately God is going to work out His purposes for good. And the message is, keep going, trust God, carry on, pray, and God will be with you.
Wonderful. I suppose one of the highlights of Elijah, as a character in the Bible as well, of course, is you think of everything he did in his life, and then when Jesus came, he goes up the mountain for the transfiguration, and who are the two who commune with him there? Moses representing the law, and Elijah representing the prophets. A wonderful man of God, and what a wonderful phrase to finish on there. In prayer, there is power because we pray to a powerful God. Thanks for joining us for this session of the James Bible Study. Do join us next week.